Welcome back to Puvin Classes. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning into this explainer today, because we are tackling an absolute giant, the Indian Constitution. If you're gearing up for UPSC, UGC NET, or really any major competitive exam, you already know this document is basically your ultimate rulebook. But let's be real, looking at it from cover to cover can feel completely overwhelming. So today, we're bringing some serious structure to your study session. We're going to decode this massive document into a high-yield, structured blueprint. No more getting lost in the pages. We're building your mental filing cabinet right now. Okay, let's dive into this. But, before we get to the articles themselves, let's talk strategy. Let's talk return on investment. If you've ever glanced at past year papers, you've probably asked yourself, just how many polity questions actually show up in the prelims? Like, why spend so much time here?
Well, the answer is a whopping 15 to 20 questions. Yeah, seriously. That is a massive chunk of your exam. And these aren't just obscure, random facts. They're this tricky mix of conceptual understanding and factual recall. Because the weightage is just so high, mastering these core polity articles, it's absolutely non-negotiable. If you want to comfortably clear that cutoff, this is the exact area where you can score consistently. It's a real game changer. So to make this vast subject actually digestible, we've broken it down into 6 highly functional chunks. We'll cover the constitutional blueprint, core rights and directives, the state machinery, constitutional watchdog bodies, emergency provisions, and finally wrap up with exam strategy and focus. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Constitutional Blueprint. This is the architecture of the whole shebang.
Just look at this original numerical breakdown. Back at its commencement, the Constitution of India was divided into 395 articles across 22 parts and 8 schedules. I mean, it was already the longest constitution in the world, and since then, through all sorts of amendments, it's grown even more. But here is the secret to exam prep. You absolutely do not need to memorize these chronologically from 1 to 395. Please don't do that. Instead, you've got to study them thematically. Once you group them by function, this massive, intimidating web actually becomes incredibly logical. Moving right along, Section 2, Core Rights and Directives. We're zooming into parts 3 and 4 here.
Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the stark difference between fundamental rights in Part 3 and the directive principles of state policy, or DSPs, in Part 4. Fundamental rights are justiciable. That literally means if your right to equality or freedom is violated, you can march straight into a court to enforce it. DSPs, on the flip side, are non-justiciable. They're basically the welfare goals and moral directives for the state. Things like securing a living wage or protecting the environment. You can't sue the government for not achieving them immediately, but they are absolutely fundamental in the governance of the country. Now, because fundamental rights are justiciable, they obviously need an enforcement mechanism, right? And this brilliantly illustrates why Dr. B.R. Ambedkar famously called Article 32 the heart and soul of the Constitution. Article 32 guarantees the right to constitutional remedies. Without it, all those other rights would just be meaningless words on paper. It allows citizens to approach the Supreme Court directly if their fundamental rights are violated. Using writs, it is the ultimate constitutional safeguard.
Next up, let's look at Article 21, the protection of life and personal liberty. Originally, this was viewed as a pretty narrow protection against executive action. But wow, over the decades, we've seen some incredible judicial creativity. The Supreme Court has vastly expanded the horizons of Article 21. Today, life doesn't just mean mere animal existence, it means a life with human dignity. Through various landmark judgments, this single, powerful article now encompasses the right to privacy, the right to health, the right to a clean environment, and even the right to a livelihood. This continuous evolution, it makes Article 21 a massive favorite for examiners in both prelims and mains.
But what exactly happens when the enforceable fundamental rights clash with the welfare goals of the DPSPs? Well, notice this fascinating historical tug-of-war on the timeline between the Supreme Court and Parliament. It kicked off back in 1952 with the Champacom-Dory-Rajan case, moved through the Goloknath case in 1967, reached the monumental case of Ananda Bharati case in 1973, which, by the way, introduced the basic structure doctrine, and finally settled down in the Minerva Mills case in 1980. The core debate was always, which part is supreme? Parliament kept trying to amend rights to implement welfare policies, while the court kept stepping in to protect individual liberties. And you know what? That conflict resulted in a very specific high-yield exam exception that you absolutely must memorize. The present position is that only two specific directive principles, Articles 39B and 39C, can actually take precedence over the fundamental rights of equality and freedom found in Articles 14 and 19. Why? Well, because 39B and C give the state the power to distribute community resources for the common good and, crucially, to prevent the concentration of wealth. Because these serve the greater public good, the courts have allowed laws implementing these two specific directives to override individual rights. Definitely remember this exception. It hits the nail on the head for a classic PYQ.
All right, moving on to Section 3, the state machinery. Let's look at the operational mechanics.
When you're studying the Union Executive and Legislature, you really want to group the most frequently tested articles to see how power actually flows at the center. It starts with Article 52, which establishes the President of India. But real executive power lies with the Council of Ministers, headed by the Prime Minister, mandated by Article 74, which aids and advises the President. Then we've got Article 79, establishing the Parliament itself. And from an exam perspective, Article 110 is totally crucial. It defines a money bill. By linking these specific articles together, you start to understand the core mechanics of how laws are made and executed. Section 4, Constitutional Watchdog Bodies. These are the independent institutions keeping things in check. Okay, here is your quick revision table. Matching these watchdog bodies to their exact articles is a total classic when it comes to prelims question formats. We have the Comptroller and Auditor General, basically the guardian of the public purse under Article 148, the Election Commission of India, administering free and fair elections under Article 324, the UPSC under Article 315, and the Finance Commission, distributing tax revenues, under Article 280. Do you notice the pattern in that third column? The appointing authority for all of these incredibly vital independent bodies is the President of India.
Now, here's a critical distinction that trips up a lot of aspirants: the difference between a constitutional body and a statutory body. A constitutional body is explicitly named and created by the Constitution itself. Changing its structure, that requires a heavy constitutional amendment. A statutory body, however, is just created by an act of Parliament, like the National Human Rights Commission. A perfect example for this is the National Commission for Backward Classes, or NCBC. It was a statutory body since 1993, but get this, it was elevated to full constitutional status by the 102nd Amendment Act in 2018. That transformation is a highly, highly tested fact.
Let's pivot to Section 5, Emergency Provisions, the ultimate Part 18 safeguards.
When we talk about emergencies, the most profound one is definitely the national emergency under Article 352. The Constitution uses the exact expression proclamation of emergency specifically for this. It essentially gives the central government sweeping powers to tackle major threats to the security of India. But it's not like it can just be declared on a whim. There are very specific grounds laid out in the Constitution for its proclamation, and those have been significantly tightened over the years to prevent any sort of misuse.
To make this super easy to recall, just put these three emergencies into one mental folder. First, Article 352, the national emergency. Next, Article 356, the state emergency, which you probably know better as President's role, which kicks in when the constitutional machinery in a specific state totally fails. And finally, Article 360, the financial emergency, which can be declared if the financial stability of India is threatened. Grouping these 350 series articles together, it's going to save you precious time in the exam hall. Finally, Section 6, Exam Strategy and Focus. Let's talk actionable prep steps. First off, a quick warning for you, do not ignore the additions. A super common mistake is focusing purely on the original text. For example, take Article 51A, the fundamental duties. That wasn't even there in 1950. It was added much later by the 42nd Amendment Act in 1976. This brilliantly illustrates that constitutional amendments, the actual changes made to the document, are tested just as heavily as the original articles. So here is your smart prep checklist for maximum retention. Number 1, do article-wise preparation, grouping them thematically exactly like we did today, rather than just painfully reading chapter by chapter. 2, always link static polity with current affairs. If a watchdog body is in the news, its corresponding article is practically guaranteed to be in the exam. 3, solve previous year questions repeatedly. It really is the absolute best way to get inside the examiner's mind. And 4, master your elimination techniques. Often in polity MCQs, knowing what is definitely wrong is just as valuable as knowing what's right. We've covered the structure, the rights, the machinery, and the strategy. So my final question to you is, Have you built your mental filing cabinet to master the constitutional blueprint? Take these semantic groupings, revisit your notes, and start slotting the information into these clear, structured categories. When you do, Indian polity completely stops being this massive memorization chore and becomes a highly logical and honestly incredibly rewarding subject to conquer. Keep revising, stay focused, and don't forget to subscribe to Pub Adam Classes for more deep dives. I'll see you in the next explainer.